Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my May wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about the 14 and a half books that I read in the month of May. So we will start off, as always, with the classics. I read a couple of Victorian books this month. This is Reuben Sax by Amy Levy. This tells the story of a young Jewish man called Reuben Sax who is doing very successfully in his kind of political career. He is going to stand to be an MP, and he is in love with a young woman called Judith, but Judith doesn't have very much money or social position, and she's probably not going to do much for his political career. And in a way, she might even hold him back. So it's kind of about the conflict between kind of love and ambition, I suppose. I found it really interesting in the way that it looks at the Jewish community in the Victorian period. Amy Levy was Jewish, and it's quite rare that I find a Victorian book that does actually deal with Jewish characters. And I mean sort of deal with several Jewish characters. There are quite a few Victorian books that has one Jewish character, often not a very nice Jewish character. But it's quite rare to find a Victorian book that deals with Judaism, or if it is, it's kind of from an outside perspective, like George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, whereas Amy Levy is Jewish. And so I found kind of that aspect of the book really interesting in terms of talking about kind of social and religious life within Jewish communities in the Victorian period. I didn't love everything about this book though. I found the ending, I don't know, I really liked the ending, but then there was an epilogue and I didn't like the epilogue, and I kind of wish the epilogue hadn't been there because I don't really think it was necessary. And there were some things in this book that didn't entirely captivate me. There were quite a few of the more minor characters in this book that I think I would have liked to be a little bit more developed. I don't think it was a perfect book by any means, but it was a very interesting one, and certainly a kind of different perspective on Victorian life to the one you typically get in a Victorian novel. I then also read Trilby by George du Maurier. George du Maurier, if you're wondering about the name, was the grandfather of Daphne du Maurier, and he was born in France but spent the majority of his life in England. This book was originally written in English. It was written in the 1890s, but it's set in the 1850s, and it follows a few young British men who are living in Paris trying to make their way as artists, and they kind of live this sort of more bohemian lifestyle in Paris, and while there they meet this model called Trilby, who is really enchanting in many ways, but who has led a kind of morally dubious life. But she is an artist model, and she regularly sort of poses nude for artists, and has also been the mistress of some of the artists who have painted her. And the book kind of follows these young three men, their relationship with Trilby, and also a few other characters around them. There were some things about this that I really, really liked. I found the exploration of like the bohemian artist world of Paris in the 1850s really, really interesting, especially in its kind of comparisons to English life. However, there were a couple of issues I had with this book. One, the main kind of villain of the book is Jewish, and his Jewishness and his villainy are quite often like tied up together in a way that's quite unpleasant, so that's obviously quite troubling. I also, like a fool, read the blurb of this book, and I should have learned by now not to read the blurbs on the back of classics, but of course the blurb tells me something that you don't find out until like the last 3 pages, so that I think slightly spoiled some of the sort of surprising elements of the plot for me. And I also, I don't know, Trilby was a really, really interesting character, and I find it really interesting how she's both kind of portrayed in this kind of typically Victorian, angelic, too good for this world, you know, like Little Nell kind of way, but then she's also a fallen woman. So I found that kind of really, really interesting. I'm not sure that I was always comfortable with the presentation of Trilby, but at the same time it's not the kind of presentation that you often come across in a Victorian novel, so in that sense maybe it was really, really interesting, even though it sometimes bothered me. I don't know. So there we have it. It was an interesting read. I'm glad I read it. I then also read a rather tiny Victorian thing. This short story is Green Tea by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. I really like J. Sheridan Le Fanu. I've read Camilla and Uncle Silas and really enjoyed them, so I thought that I would pick up a little black classic of his, and this is Green Tea. It is a kind of supernatural mystery story. This doctor is writing letters to a friend, writing notes about this case where he met this man who kind of saw this phantom monkey everywhere that would tell him to do things, and it's really creepy and really interesting, and I really like how J. Sheridan Le Fanu kind of blends science and the supernatural in what's a really interesting way, especially because this is written from the perspective of a doctor. That was something I really enjoyed. I also think he's great at doing the atmosphere. He's a very, very atmospheric writer and really, really good, I think, at kind of creating suspense in a book. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. It's tiny, but it was really good fun. I like J. Sheridan Le Fanu a lot, and I definitely need to read more by him in the future. Moving on from the Victorians, the other Penguin little black classic I read this month was A Terrible Beauty is Born by Yeats. These are some of Yeats's collected poems. I have very little to say about this. I just don't really have any strong feelings about this. I've been meaning to read some of Yeats for ages, but I found that very few of these poems kind of moved me. There were a few that I kind of recognised, but that was about as far as my emotional engagement went. I just think Yeats is not really for me. It was weird because some of his poems would kind of remind me of Hardy's poetry, but they never seem to quite pack the punch of Hardy's poetry, and I love Hardy's poetry so much. I enjoyed some of the World War I poems in here, but for the most part these just kind of passed me by a little bit, so I just think Yeats is not really for me, but I am glad that I finally read some of his poetry. I then have The 3-Act Tragedy by Agatha Christie, which I took out from the library, and this I buddy read with Carolyn from Carolyn's Reading Rambles. I'll link her channel down below, and I really enjoyed this. I love a good Agatha Christie, and this is a Poirot novel, although Poirot is not necessarily the main character. We follow a man called Sir Charles, who is an actor, and what happens when a man dies at a dinner party of his, and kind of everything goes on from there. It's really fun, like all Agatha Christie. I love her writing, and they're such quick and easy reads. Like, I read this in, I don't know, 2 days, and it was really enjoyable. I love her writing style so much. I love that the book is so dialogue heavy. I love seeing all the clues and how they come together. I can in general never guess the murderer, but I really don't mind. That's not what I'm reading them for. I'm reading it just for the kind of sheer fun of it, I suppose, in a way. Yeah, I really love Agatha Christie, looking forward to reading more by her in the future. I then also read My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. This was one of my favourite reads of May. I really loved it. I read Rebecca earlier on in the year and just fell in love with Daphne du Maurier's writing style, and this book was no exception. It was just magnificent. You probably heard a lot about it on Booktube because it has been going around, and also there was a film adaptation last year which I really need to watch. But it follows a young man called Philip. He has been brought up by his guardian, who's about sort of 15-20 years older than himself, and his guardian goes abroad for his health, and while there ends up meeting a distant relation of the family called Rachel, who he marries, and then while Philip's guardian Ambrose is out in Italy married to Rachel, he dies, and Rachel comes to England, where Philip meets her and becomes kind of infatuated with her. I think the way that Daphne du Maurier creates kind of atmosphere and suspense is just brilliant. Like, it's such an engaging read. I flew through it and like kept on going through the pages so quickly because it's just so engaging and you so want to know what is about to happen. It's quite similar to Rebecca in that respect, but it's also very different to Rebecca, and the narrative voice is really different. And Philip is such an interesting character, and Rachel too, fascinating, and the way that their kind of relationship and their personalities develop over the course of the book is something I really loved. I thought it was absolutely magnificent, and I loved it a lot. I love Daphne du Maurier's writing. I can't wait to read more by her. And I then also read The Acceptance Well by Anthony Powell. This is the third book in his series A Dance with the Musical Time. I won't say too much about it here as I've done a full review on it, which I will link down below, but I read this as part of the read long I am currently doing for this book series. I love the whole series. I really love this book. In this we pick up with our narrator in his late 20s and we follow his relationship with one particular woman, as well as kind of all the different characters that crop up around him. It's episodical, it's funny, it's deep, it's complicated, and I just love it. I love the series so much. That's pretty much all I have to say. I then also read The Children of Dillmouth by William Trevor. This is a book from the 70s that one of my friends from my creative writing group lent me, thinking it would be quite interesting for a book that I'm currently working on, and quite helpful in terms of looking at life in the 70s, I guess, which it really was. It was a really interesting book, and I liked it not exactly much more than I was expecting to, but I didn't really know what to think going into it, and actually I really adored it. It's set in the 1970s in a small town on the coast called Dillmouth, and follows various people in this town, specifically focusing on one young boy of about 15 who is just one of the most unpleasant characters I've ever encountered in literature, who basically spends his life finding out stuff about all the people in this village in order to blackmail them. And he blackmails them not for money, but for kind of props for this comedic act he wants to put on at the Easter Fete. And yet even then, it's almost like he's blackmailing them just for the hell of it and just for the fun of it and just because he's bored and unhappy, rather than because he actually wants to put on this show. It's really interesting and kind of psychologically complex, and it reminded me in many ways actually of The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling. I think especially in the way that it looks like kind of a small town and the relationships between the kind of younger generation and the older generation there. And it's really interesting and something I really enjoyed. There are a few bits of it that feel a little bit dated in terms of its attitudes. For the most part it was a really interesting read, and one that I would highly recommend. Obviously not one that I had talked about very much being from the 70s, but a really interesting book, and pushes me, I think, to read some more things from the second half of the 20th century, because just I haven't really read much from that period at all. On to some contemporary literary fiction. This month I read The White Tiger by Aravind Adiga. This was a book I found really interesting. I buddy read this with Leanne Rose. I'll link her channel down below. We both really enjoyed this. It was one of those books where it wasn't necessarily like one of our favourite books we've ever read, but we kind of have nothing to fault it with. It's set in India and follows a young man as he kind of leaves his village and goes to work as a chauffeur for some very wealthy people. For the most part it is a book about class and a book about kind of social struggles and social inferiority in India and the way that the class system works and how restrictive it is. It is a book about kind of being trapped by your social class and about the lengths it can drive people to. We find out quite early on in the book that our main character, our narrator, has done some quite bad things in his time, and yet we come throughout the book to really understand why. And I think it's such an interesting book for looking at that and for looking at the kind of psychological impact of a really strict class system and the struggles to get out of it. It's a novel of social critique in many ways, but it's also a novel about kind of personal ambition and drive, and it's such an interesting book and one that I would highly recommend. And in May I also finished The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber. I mentioned in my April wrap-up that I was halfway through it then and not really enjoying it, and my final thoughts are that I didn't really like it very much. There is a full review coming on this because I do have a lot to say, and I also feel like I need to explain the reasons why I didn't like it, because I think part of the reason why I didn't like it is because I read it wrong. Like, I think I didn't really understand what Michelle Faber was trying to do until the end, and I still think that means that maybe he didn't do it very effectively, at least where I'm concerned. This is set in the Victorian period, and it follows a man called William who becomes obsessed with this prostitute called Sugar, and kind of about their relationship and also his relationship with his wife. I had a lot of issues with this book. A lot of them were to do with the way this book kind of looks at gender and kind of male and female positions within Victorian society and kind of attitudes towards sex in the Victorian period. I also had a lot of issues with the kind of like plotting of it. I think it's a bit too long really. It didn't feel like it got going until the last like third, and there were some subplots that I was really enjoying which just like disappeared halfway through for no apparent reason. I think the fact that I hated the main character William so much, and not just hated him but found him not very interesting to read about, was one of the main issues I had with this. I gave it 2 stars on Goodreads, so I didn't sort of hate everything about it, and for me the ending kind of redeemed some issues with the book, although saying that I do think the ending was not incredibly well done. Like, I think it was a bit abrupt, but the plot decisions made in the end were something I agreed with and did like. Anyway, I could go on about the reasons why I disliked this book for quite a long time, so there will be a full review coming on this very soon. I haven't edited the video yet, but I have filmed it, and it's currently 45 minutes long, so it might be a rather long review, and it will be half spoiler free and half spoilery, because suffice to say, this was absolutely not for me. This was not my kind of historical fiction. It was unrelentingly bleak, and for me, a real drag to get through. I do kind of understand why other people like it, but it's just really, really not for me. But yes, a full review will come on this one. Then I also read 2 books for younger readers this month. This is Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This is a proof copy. The final one doesn't look like this because another company within Hachette where I work was publishing this. A lot of us had proof copies of this put on our desks, and so I picked it up. It's been sat on my shelf for a while, and I kind of thought to myself, oh well, I might as well read it. It's been on my shelf for a while and it'll be a quick, easy read. Oh, I love this so much. I wasn't expecting to adore this as much as I did. It was absolutely wonderful. It was a really, really just beautiful, fun book. Like, I can't remember the last time I read a book that was so utterly enjoyable, like just so utterly such fun to read. Like, I understand why everyone is comparing this to Harry Potter, and although like it's very, very different, it is its own thing, I also think, you know, it deals with a 11-year-old stuck in a miserable life, finding out that they're special and ending up sort of being taken on by a mentor figure who doesn't always tell them what's going on. It's wonderful. It follows this girl called Morrigan Crow, and she's been brought up her whole life knowing that she is a cursed child and that she is due to die on her 11th birthday. And then she turns 11 and she doesn't die. Instead, she gets taken away to the land of Nevermore by a man called Jupiter, who says that he is going to enter her to join something called the Wondrous Society, and she has to go through various sort of trials and tests in order to get into this society. It was just really, really fun. There are talking cats, people fly about with umbrellas. Jupiter owns this hotel that just like respawns itself and changes, so Morrigan gets a room, and when she goes in it's very plain, and then the longer she stays there the more the room comes to suit her needs and be the kind of room she wants, and it just kind of like changes in the middle of the night. It's just really, really fun, really delightful, well plotted, so thoroughly enjoyable, and yeah, I just can't recommend it enough. Really, really can't recommend it enough. It was wonderful. It was such a joy to read, and I can't wait to read the rest in the series as they come out. And then I also read The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman, which is the second book in his Dark Materials trilogy, and Nick and I have been re-listening to these on audiobook, and we've been listening to this one for quite a while and finished it this month. I love his Dark Materials. It is one of my favourite series ever. I think it's like the emotional impact of that series is so great. I mean, we listened to the ending of The Subtle Knife on the bus, and I was just sat there like crying because it was just so emotionally powerful. You probably have heard about what his Dark Materials is about, but basically it follows this young girl called Lyra, and in the second book a young boy called Will. Lyra is from another world and Will is from our world, and they meet in a world between our world. Both of them have a kind of quest in a way that they are on, and in this book they meet and things go on from there. I love this series so much. I love the overarching plot. I love the way the books look at growing up and childhood. I love the way the books look at religion and individuality and relationships between people and kind of loyalty and family and so many different things. I think it's such a brilliant book, and they're so emotionally engaging and so powerful and moving and so layered and rich. It's one of the things I love about this series. This is the third time I'm reading them. I read them as a child, I read them when I was about 21, and then reading them now, and you do get more out of them every time, I think, and it's wonderful. Yeah, I cannot recommend this series enough. I then also read a short story collection this month. This is An Unrestored Woman by Shopra Rao, and I loved this. This is another of my favourite things I've read so far this year. It was really, really incredible, and this focuses in part on the division of India and Pakistan in 1947, but it spans sort of wider than that, both forward and backward in history from that point, so looking at women in India and Pakistan, and often at their lack of power and the way that their kind of bodies are used against them. Incredibly, incredibly powerful. The writing is magnificent and just brilliant, and so well done throughout. But there are three things I think especially that I really loved about this collection. One is that the stories are interlinked, so there are a few characters who crop up in other characters' stories, which is just something I love in short story collections. It's something I find incredibly rewarding. Another thing I really loved is that the way that this book engages with history, because I think it does it really, really interestingly, especially because it does span quite a long period of time and the stories take place at different moments. I think that is really, really well done, and the way that this book looks at how different events in the history of India and Pakistan and different kind of cultural norms and expectations have affected women throughout history. That was something I really, really loved. And another thing I loved about this collection, the thing that I think makes this collection so brilliant, is that this book deals with incredibly harrowing situations and several incredibly harrowing moments. Yet despite the fact that it is a book that deals with rape and abuse and forced prostitution and murder and so many other harrowing things, it is also a book that has a lot of hope in it and a lot of moments of empowerment and moments of real kind of hope for the future and in humanity, which it could have very easily not done, I guess, but that for me made it so much more powerful and made it just such a fantastic collection that I would really, really, really highly recommend this book. This is a library book that I'm really loath to give back to the library because I really want to keep it. It was so, so good, and I cannot recommend this book enough. Strongly, strongly urge everyone to read this. It was magnificent. The last book that I finished this month was a non-fiction read, and this I read on audiobook. This is Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. This was a really interesting read. I don't know that I would have picked it up if Nick had not read it before and recommended it to me. Genghis Khan is a figure from history I knew very, very little about. I know very little, to be honest, about history before 1789, but certainly nothing about Genghis Khan, and so listening to a history of his life and sort of the Mongol Empire after him and his kind of influence on the world afterwards was really, really fascinating. I thought this book was really well written and really engaging and very easy and accessible for someone who doesn't know anything about that period in history, and I found it really, really interesting to read. It's kind of split into three sections, and I found the kind of first and last, I think, the most interesting. The first looks at kind of a biography of Genghis Khan in a way, looking at his life and what he achieved. The second book looks at kind of his descendants and what happened afterwards, which was the bit I found kind of hardest to get my teeth into. And then the final section looks at kind of Mongol culture and society and how that influenced what happened after Genghis Khan's death and after kind of the fall of the Mongol Empire, and that was something I found really, really interesting, something I knew very little about, and a really, really interesting read, so I would definitely recommend that book by Jack Weatherford. Finally, there is one book that I am halfway through at the moment, and that is The Immortalist by Chloe Benjamin. I have to say that I am absolutely adoring this. She writes brilliantly, and she has that wonderful power of taking kind of small moments and everyday life and making it intensely beautiful and intensely emotionally raw. This book follows 4 siblings over the course of their lives, and what happens in the very first chapter of the book is that these 4 siblings go and see a woman who is supposed to be supernatural, who's supposed to be a seer, and she tells them all individually the date on which they will die. And the book is kind of split into quarters which follow a sibling each, and I have just got through the first 2 siblings and this book is amazing. I think that's all I have to say. Those are all the books that I read in the month of May. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the books I read this month and what you thought of them. I really, really love to know your thoughts, and also let me know what you've been reading in the month of May and what your best read of the month was. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.